Wonderful. Hello, everyone who is joining online. Thank you so much for joining for this presentation about the Knowing History curriculum. I'm going to start by speaking for about 20 minutes about how it came to exist, the curriculum and the textbooks that have been published by Collins. And then Harry, who is the head of history at the West London Free School, is going to talk about how we actually use them practically within our own classrooms here as a sort of case study of the school. I should introduce myself. I am the series editor of Knowing History. As I will talk about in just a moment, I developed the curriculum when I first came to teach at the West London Free School in 2014. I became deputy head teacher there in 2019 and joint head teacher in 2021, where I remain in post with oversight of all things academic and curriculum based. But history teaching is still very dear to my heart. I still teach 6 hours a week, and I still very much enjoy teaching from this history curriculum at Key Stage 3 that we developed at this school. So in terms of the genesis of the books, they are in their second edition now, which was published in 2022, which has been expanded particularly to have a better balance of world and British history. But the first editions were published in 2016, and they really had their origin here at the West London Free School, where I joined in 2014. And we were in this very unusual, very fortuitous position, I suppose, which was that we only had 4 year groups at the time. We had year 7, year 8, year 9, and year 10. So the vast majority of my teaching when I joined as a history teacher was Key Stage 3. And it meant that I had the luxury, really, of thinking a great deal about Key Stage 3 history. And I remember finding as a trainee teacher that the hardest thing to find, but also the most valuable, was good reading material for history lessons. Sources in the age of the internet, so easy to find, such a luxury to be able to find amazing images and letters and texts to do source work for with history. Similarly, thinking up activities and assessments, that was something that was very enjoyable and, although time consuming, relatively easy to do. But it was finding the actual content that pupils were going to learn that I found really tricky. And I thought that the existing textbooks which existed in the market didn't really hit the sweet spot that a comprehensive school like the West London Free School required. And what we wanted to teach a knowledge-rich and academically ambitious curriculum, but we wanted it to be something that pupils of all ability levels, which we have as a school, could access. And I found the books were either too simplistic and would often try and sell history to pupils by making it fun with lots of cartoons and speech bubbles and activities and that sort of thing. And I thought, that's not the type of history teaching we want to do. We want to take the subject more seriously than that. And there were some textbooks which were more text-based and which were more academically ambitious, often ones that were published for the independent sector, but those were too far in the other direction. Those were ones that some of our pupils would struggle with. So I started working on trying to find a good compromise of those two different types that existed on the market already. And I was very fortunate at the time that the head of religious education at the school had a very similar vision. So in 2014, when we were both starting at the school, we decided that we would design some textbooks together, initially just for internal use. And it was only 2 years later that we ended up in touch with Collins and they turned into the Knowing History series and also the Knowing Religion series. And the fundamental question that we really asked ourselves at the start, I suppose, and I believe Harriet is going to do a poll for us here, is we have 55-minute lessons at the West London Free School, and we wanted to think in 55 minutes, how much unfamiliar historical text can a mixed ability group of Key Stage 3 pupils reasonably expected to read and understand in an hour? And I believe that Harriet is going to be able to put together a poll for us, which you will be able to vote in, and we will get some results. So if you will just take a moment to vote in question 1, that should be 500. So 500 words, 500 to 1,000, or 1,000 plus. What do you think? And Whenever we're ready to see the results, let us know. Interesting. So 67% have gone with 500 words, 33% have gone with 500 to 1,000 words, and 0%, probably quite understandably, have gone with 1,000 words. We actually were with the middle. We thought 500 to 1,000 words was what we wanted to get pupils reading and understanding in the space of a 55-minute lesson. And our books were based really around that principle. And all of the books are a double-page spread for every chapter. And every chapter, of which there are 5 per unit, contains somewhere in the region of 700 to 800 words. And this, in our conception of it, is a lesson. So here is an example of a lesson in our Crusades unit on the First Crusade. And as you can see, that is the amount of text that we hoped pupils would get through. And I thought that the writing of this text is so important. It's vital to make sure that the knowledge is well sequenced, that keywords are highlighted the first time they appear, and that there are corresponding definitions which appear elsewhere in the textbook, that the sentences, they're very much designed to be read out aloud by the classes. So the sentences are short. They tend not to start with the subordinate clause because that always really confuses the reader. The paragraphs are also themselves quite short, and there are no sort of needlessly complicated words that are going to strain cognitive load. We really wanted to make sure that pupils are learning a huge amount of history, but we're not making it needlessly difficult for them. So if this is a textbook series that you're interested in buying into, I would say that that is its major selling point, is they're quite simple, the textbooks. There are images, but they're not replete with images. They're definitely best taught with a PowerPoint to supplement them if you want to have lots and lots of vivid imagery. But what they do have is really carefully thought through prose, which we believe pupils, the vast majority of pupils at a comprehensive school, can access. So that's how it was designed. Now, the next big question that we had to think about, we knew what we wanted these double-page spreads to look like. We then had to actually think, right, what's it going to include? So I'd like us to do a poll. 10 different events there which are commonly or maybe not so commonly found on Key Stage 3 history curriculum. I would like you to vote, if we have the poll come up for this one, on which of those you currently teach in your current Key Stage 3 curriculum. So hopefully we will have our poll appear and you can all share your votes, and I will pause for a minute before we get those results.
Hi, I think we're having some technical difficulties with the poll, but if you could put in the chat, everyone, which one of these topics you do in your school, if any, that would be great. Thank you.
Super, thank you, Harriet. So yeah, just list which of these you teach and press return into the chat. Excellent. So Dan is saying they do Norman Invasion, Crusades, Henry VIII, English Civil War, Industrial Revolution, and either or both of the First and Second World Wars. Jess, Norman Invasion, Henry VIII, Industrial Revolution, World Wars. Abigail, 1, 2, 4, 6, 8, 9. So Norman Invasion, Crusades, Henry VIII, English Civil War, Industrial Revolution, World Wars. So we're starting to get a common picture. There are definitely some things which are more commonly taught than others. And my impression of Key Stage 3 history teaching is that you find more of the variation in what people choose to study in terms of international units. In terms of the units of study that you do, which are British history, there is quite an established sequence that most schools will follow. Norman invasion, you'll do a bit of Henry VIII, you'll do the English Civil War, the First and Second World Wars, often from a UK perspective, but not necessarily. And it's interesting, we've got out of the 4 who voted, 3 have said the Crusades. So that's one of the global units that is more commonly taught. I don't think we've had anyone say the French Revolution yet. Harry will correct me if I'm wrong, my knowledge here might be out of date, but we did teach the French Revolution. I'm not sure if we still do, but we felt that that was an important one. The point is on this, I have always been very, very agnostic about what content is taught. I think as long as you have a very, very good rationale for the units that you've chosen, you can have 2 history curriculum from 2 different schools with very little crossover, and both will be excellent and both will have a lot to recommend them. Now, I think when it comes to your sort of British unit of studies, there maybe is more of a sense of the things that really, really are core knowledge. But again, if you teach the English Civil War, but you don't teach the Industrial Revolution, and if you teach the Industrial Revolution but don't teach the English Civil War, I think both could be equally credible decisions. And the hardest thing with history teaching is there is just so much content. There is so much that you could choose to teach, and you are always going to have to make sacrifices, and you're always going to have to make difficult decisions and trade one unit for another. And I think as history teachers, we have to be comfortable doing that. And the Knowing History textbooks are designed for teachers to make those sorts of decisions. So this shows from book 1 to book 4 all of the different units that exist. And there are 10 units in each book. Each book has, roughly speaking, a 50-50 split of global history and British history. And our expectation is these units are best taught over the course of a half term. They're designed with 5 chapters per unit. If you are doing 1 history lesson a week in Key Stage 3, that gives you 5 weeks of teaching and maybe a week or 2 for revision and assessment at the end. And roughly speaking, notwithstanding the fact that the autumn term is always monstrously long and then you get these horribly short terms in the summer term, but fundamentally it should fit quite neatly into a unit, which are each of these things here on the screen, per half term. Now, if you're doing a 3-year Key Stage 3, that gives you 18 units. And we've got 40 units that have been written in the textbooks. So the textbooks are written with an acknowledgement that at least, but probably more than half of the textbooks will never get taught. And that all comes down to the choice of what you're going to teach. And I think, as I said, I think this is something that we as history teachers can be relatively agnostic about. There are some things that feel really, really fundamental. It would be weird to have a history curriculum without Henry VIII and the Reformation in it, or without maybe, although maybe this is less taught, the Industrial Revolution. But whether you choose to teach the French Revolution or Edo-Japan, or whether you choose to teach Mughal India or King China, I think all laudable decisions. And that's really the spirit in which the textbooks are written. So in terms of the global versus British split, you'll see that it's about a 50-50 split. In our 4th textbook on 20th century British and world history, you'll see the First World War we sort of include as British history, and then the Second World War is written from a more global perspective. But it's a 50-50 split in the textbooks. Harry will talk about this more in terms of what we actually choose to teach. In terms of what we choose to teach, it's more of a sort of 2/3 UK history, 1/3 global history split. And I think in most schools, you'll find that the global history that you do, there's probably more variation than the British history. And he is going to talk in just a moment about precisely how we choose to divide it up ourselves. So just for the last bit to mention myself, this is what the contents page looks like for book 4, the one that looks at 20th century British and world history. And you will see that it is extremely consistent in how it is written. Every single unit has 5 chapters. Every chapter is about 800 words and covers a double-page spread. Every unit has a knowledge organizer at the end of it, which is keywords, key dates, key people. And every unit also has an inquiry question, which if you want to do some sort of assessment essay at the end of it, something based on that question is really sort of the way in which the 5 chapters will have been written. And the whole reason that we've done this is we hope that people who use the textbooks will think, once you've done it once with one of the units, you get a sense of the pattern. You realize how it works and you don't have to relearn how it's all been laid out for another unit. It should be very, very neat to look at these contents and then be able to base your scheme of work around them, which is precisely what Harry is now going to speak about for the second part of the presentation. Harry, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Rob. And perhaps if I just share my screen to begin with, and then we will take it from there. Right, go. Okay, great. There we go. Let's just make that. There we go. Hopefully you can now see the PowerPoint slide deck. Right, yes, thank you very much, Rob. So I'm the head of history at Westland Free School, and I've worked closely with Rob over the last sort of 5 years or so, in large part developing the history curriculum here and what we teach. And I'll sort of start really where Rob left off. And obviously one of the challenges we all face as history teachers is that challenge of what do we teach in the limited time we have. It's the perennial frustration really as history teachers. There's so much good history out there, but we only have a relatively limited amount of time in which to teach it. So how do you choose what to do? And obviously this is purely focusing on the Key Stage 3 curriculum, and the decisions we make are largely informed as well by what we do, or informed to an extent at least by what we do at GCSE and A level, where we do also have scope to introduce pupils to more history. But in Key Stage 3, if we have 18 half terms, and we do operate on the principle, as Rob was talking about there, of 1 unit per half term, how are we going to choose what to do? And I should say as well, the curriculum that we have here is one that was in parts something that I inherited from predecessors in the role, but it's something that we have sort of worked on, we have tweaked, we have developed over the years since as well. And we do follow, as I'm sure most schools do, a sort of broadly chronological approach. And in year 7, we start with the Anglo-Saxons, we go through the Normans, we do a cracking unit of medieval monarchs, which the pupils absolutely love. We talk about medieval queens in that unit as well. And then we go through the Crusades, with Henry VIII, the sort of early Henry VIII, that is, the Reformation. And then we do quite a wide-ranging unit about Renaissance Europe, which includes things like the witch hunts. It includes sort of global exploration, Columbus and that sort of thing as well. So it's a really varied year 7 curriculum, and it's one that pupils absolutely love. But for an introduction to sort of secondary school history, it doesn't get much better than this, really. And our teachers love teaching it as well. The stories, the characters involved make this really really enjoyable to teach. And the kind of aim here is to sort of act as a hook, really, to get those pupils who perhaps haven't had that much history at primary, also maybe for whom history hasn't been their thing at primary, is to try and get them hooked at the start of Key Stage 3. Then in year 7, we sort of continue chronologically. We go into sort of early modern period. We talk about the later Tudors, the English Civil War, and that unit in the textbook is sort of includes a bit of military history and a bit more sort of the political history as well. And then we go into a combined unit, actually, and I'll talk a bit more about this in a minute, where we've combined 2 of the units in the textbook together to form this kind of hybrid unit in the first term of the spring, Protectorate, Restoration and Union, which goes really from sort of Oliver Cromwell through to sort of the Hanoverian succession and then Robert Walpole. And then we do slavery and the abolition of the slave trade, Industrial Revolution and the sort of social reform which accompanied it. And then we do a unit at the end of year 8 on the rise of the British Empire. So that is looking at the rise of empire with sort of case studies in North America, in India, in Australia, and in various other places too. Then in year 9, we take pretty much a 20th century path. And we start with the First World War. We then look at the unit on Russia. So that goes back actually to the Tsars. So that looks at sort of the later Tsars and then goes all the way through to Khrushchev. Then we do Nazis and the Holocaust, and that really is a sort of unit that focuses on the Holocaust in particular. It does talk about the rise of Hitler, but it's really more as a vehicle to get to the later years and the war years in particular. Then we do a unit which sort of dovetails with the unit at the end of year 8 on the empire. We look at decolonization. So having looked at the rise of empire at the end of year 8, we then look at its sort of demise and its fall in year 9. Then at the end of year 9, we have a really an excellent couple of units, which again sort of end the key stage in theory on a high, really, in terms of piquing sort of students' interests. We do a unit at civil rights in the USA, and then we do a unit on modern China, which is really 20th century China. So it mainly focuses around Mao and then the successors of Mao as well. And obviously there's that difficult period, isn't there, at the end of year 9 when options choices have been made, and you've got those pupils in your year 9 classes who've decided they're not going to do history. So we really wanted to try and end year 9 with units that would both lead the way nicely into Key Stage 4 for those who are doing history, which is the majority here, but then also would retain the interest of those who decided not to. So that's the curriculum we have put together. In terms of how that sort of correlates with the textbooks, you can see there, I've sort of color-coded them there. So year 7 is primarily using the first of those 4 textbooks, sort of medieval textbook. Then year 8 and year 9 move into the early modern textbook. The second half, sorry, that's the end of year 7 and start of year 8, use the early modern textbook. Then the modern textbook is the second half of year 8. And then year 9, we solely use the 20th century world textbook there. And that kind of covers the bases there. And it's worth saying, and I'll talk about this a little bit at the end, that pupils like, in our experience and in kind of some of the student voice we've done, they like that sense of progression between the textbooks, and that sense that they're sort of almost graduating from one textbook to the next. Now that sort of curriculum map that we have developed, which, as Rob said, is maybe sort of 2/3 British history, roughly, and 1/3 global history. That maps onto what we've developed in our sort of assessment policy as well, or sort of the skills focus too, because obviously the textbooks are very knowledge rich, and that's obviously the purpose. And we sort of marry them up with the skills that we want to teach over the course of Key Stage 3. And these again are partly just the kind of the bread and butter skills that as history teachers we want to teach, but also they are the skills that we know are going to be really important at GCSE and at A-level. So we're sort of feeding them into the curriculum, again, as I'm sure colleagues on the call do in their curricula too. And you can see in year 7, we start really with the basics, and we think about sort of selecting evidence. So in that Anglo-Saxon England unit, we're really in the lessons which focus more on writing, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. We focus on picking evidence to justify a point. We then think about explanations, obviously the bane of GCSE history teachers' life, getting kids to write good explanations. So we start out quite early with an explicit focus on that at the start of year 7. And then the second half really, or the second 2/3, I suppose, of year 7 are about writing an essay and really getting pupils into the habit from an early stage of writing full essays. And when they do that, we get them to write essays without a plan in front of them. So what we often do is we will tell them the essay question in advance, and we'll do at least a lesson, sometimes a lesson and a half of essay planning with them. But then they have a whole lesson at the end of the unit to write an essay on the unit they have studied. And one of the things, when we adopted this approach, and we've sort of tinkered with it a little bit over the last few years, but we were a little bit nervous actually about what we would see when we set year 7s loose without many prompts to write an essay. And every year it blows us away actually at the quality of what they can write. And it really is a case actually of if you set the expectations kind of high enough, or if you set the bar high enough, the vast majority of them really do rise to meet it, and in lots of cases surpass it too. Then in year 8, that's where we introduce source analysis. So you can see in first couple of half terms, then in the second half term of the spring, we do source work, and they are sources clearly that rate those units. So obviously the Tudors lends itself quite nicely to sources, the Civil War II with sort of woodcuts and that sort of thing. And then again, there's lots of really good sources in that slavery and abolition unit. A lot of the sources used by abolitionists and things like, I'm sure you can imagine the sort of thing we use. We do intersperse that though in year 8 with essay writing too, and we don't want them to sort of lose the habit of writing essays. So the first term of spring, and then the final term, the first term, sorry, the summer, we get them to write essays there. Then in year 9, again, you can see essays and sources continue. And then year 9 is where we introduce interpretations, again, slightly with a view to that interpretations paper at GCSE, but also just because we want them to by this stage, we feel they're confident enough in the difference, or it's sort of grounded enough in what sources are to be able to then start to get them thinking about, well, how do historians build historical interpretations using primary sources? So all of those, I say, map onto the assessments we use, and we have placed the different sort of skills we're teaching where we have, partly sort of thinking about the sorts of skills we want to develop at what age, but also actually trying to match good skills with good units. The Russia course lends itself really well to interpretation, for example. Again, the Nazis, again, as I'm sure sort of colleagues are familiar with, there are lots of excellent sources for the Nazis that we can teach there. The final thing, just to show you on this curriculum map, is that, and this is an innovation actually that we've introduced in the last couple of years, is trying to match up the sort of the units we're teaching with substantive concepts. So one of the things we've put together over the last couple of years, and this is still very much something that we are sort of playing around with at the moment, we're trialing it and we're sort of filling with it as we go through, is we've drawn up a list of 7 substantive concepts that we want pupils to be familiar with by the end of Key Stage 3. And we have sort of allocated them, as you can see, to certain units in the Key Stage 3 curriculum. So in Year 7, we start with religion and ideology, and we go through social structure, power, war and conflict, power again, and then we end Year 7 again by linking back to religion and ideology. And you can see I won't go through them all, but we've done that for each of the units. And part of the reason we've done this, well, a large reason we've done this, is, of course, that these concepts are concepts we want them to be familiar with. These are sort of overarching historical concepts that we want our pupils to know. And we felt that actually we were kind of talking about them in a more ad hoc way, but we weren't sort of explicitly addressing them head on. And they weren't kind of codified in a way that was common across the department. So we wanted to make that happen. So we sort of integrated them into our curriculum. Worth saying too that we wanted to do this partly as a way of tying the curriculum together. Now, again, this is something that sort of we do as history teachers on a sort of ad hoc basis anyway. We try and draw links between different areas of study. We try and cast their minds back to stuff they've studied in previous years or in earlier half terms. But one of the things we wanted to do was to try and formalize that, at least to an extent. And obviously it's hard to do. We primarily want to focus on sort of teaching them the knowledge, teaching them the stories that they're learning. But actually by codifying the substantive concepts in this way, it sort of helps them to draw those sorts of links between some of the units of history that they are studying. So really, a sort of obvious example in a way is in Year 9, we have just taught the Nazis and the Holocaust unit before half term. And that was the substantive concept focus there was religion and ideology. And we were able to draw comparisons and similarities to the religions or ideologies in particular that we'd focused on in the Russia unit just before Christmas. And that was a really nice way of kind of tying the 2 units together while reinforcing those substantive concepts. And the textbooks kind of lend themselves quite nicely to that because of the regular way in which they are structured. In terms of planning a lesson then, so that's the curriculum. In terms of how we would go about planning and then delivering a lesson, as Rob sort of talked you through there, we have, well, each of the textbook pages has a double page spread. And what we generally would expect teachers in the department to do as they're planning, as part of their planning, is to take a double page spread and annotate it. And we're not kind of looking for heavy annotations, but we're looking for annotations where they're going through a double page spread and identifying, firstly, what are the really key bits of knowledge? What are the kind of the key bits of knowledge around which the rest of the text is structured? And really drawing attention to those in our own minds so that when we're delivering to pupils, obviously, we are able to draw their attention to that as well. Also things like difficult words that we're going to need to define, just annotating those on. And then also actually opportunities for things like questioning. What questions are we going to want to ask pupils off the back of this text? Where are there opportunities to really extend their thinking? Where are there sort of hidden bits of background knowledge, contextual knowledge that we might need to provide them with so that they can really understand where the text is going? And that is a process, that process of reading and annotating the text is one that obviously leads to more effective lessons ultimately when they are delivered. We also, I should say as well, operate with quite a centralized set of resources. So that by and large kind of is it when it comes to resourcing. We have a set of textbooks for each class, so we don't have to do any photocopying. All resources that we do want, we have photocopied already in booklets that pupils get at the start of the year. So that means lesson by lesson, there is literally no photocopying, no kind of printing, no copying and sticking, sort of cutting and sticking, which is obviously a massive time saver as well. And because these texts are there, it means that colleagues don't have to spend time finding texts or indeed writing texts, and their planning really is limited to going through the text sort of carefully and annotating it, and then looking at the PowerPoints, and if necessary, absolutely adapting the PowerPoints, making changes to the PowerPoints. So the PowerPoints are designed to be, and I'll show you some PowerPoints in a sec, but the PowerPoints are designed to be very much to kind of support rather than a straitjacket, and kind of matching up the text with the PowerPoint as appropriate. And then in terms of PowerPoints, then, so we always have, this is kind of a standard first opening slide of a PowerPoint. You can see there's the title, there's a date, and pupils would be copying those down into their books. We always have, as well, you can see there's a kind of a background image as well. That is a unifying image across each unit. So in the Anglo-Saxons unit, we have the Sutton Hoo helmet, and that is kind of the background image for each slide. And again, pupils seem to like that, the sort of uniformity and regularity that provides. And then as the slides go through, we generally adopt an approach of kind of less is more. Lessons often start with a knowledge quiz. Sometimes, as here, that would be projected on the board. Sometimes that would be, this kind of slide would be hidden, and the teacher would ask these questions one by one, and pupils would answer them on their mini whiteboards, which they have with them at all times. And these questions are usually recap of the previous lesson, so recalling the previous lesson they've done, and they are obviously sort of awakening prior learning so that they can bed the new learning they're doing into that context. So they'd start with that. And then, as I say, less is more is generally the approach we would take. So we use a lot of maps. So you can see that's a whole page, whole slide just with a map on it. Particularly for some of the units which go abroad as well, we use maps to illustrate that. They would have keywords. And again, depending on the importance of the keyword or the teacher's preference, pupils would copy those down into their book or not, but they would be projected clearly on the board so that pupils can be sort of pre-taught those before they encounter them in the reading. And then we go heavy on images as well, and really using images to try and bring to life the text that pupils are reading. And again, obviously it varies how we use these. Sometimes we put these up simultaneously, sometimes we'd use these as a part of a recap, but we really do try and use some of these images to complement the texts that we are reading. So you can see this is one we use for vellum, when we're talking about vellum in the Anglo-Saxons unit, and it's one that tends to catch their imagination, and obviously that sense of sort of dual coding helps as well. And one of the things that I certainly love about using these textbooks is the way that they allow us to just really go to town on the knowledge. There's no kind of fluff in the way. And as history teachers, that's kind of the stuff of history is the stuff, obviously, that makes us want to teach history, and the sort of the joy of history is what we want to impart. And obviously here's an illumination, and the texts talk about illuminations, and they are there really then as a launch pad, as a springboard in my explanation of the text to go to town on it. And I would put up this image, and I would kind of wax lyrical about the joys of medieval illuminations, having just read the kind of the grounding of that in the textbook. So again, there's a slight misconception, I think, sometimes, and this is something we encounter sometimes with new colleagues when they join, that the textbooks are kind of the limit of what they need to know, when really I would kind of view the textbooks as the kind of the grounding, the basis from which I then can elaborate and expand upon in my own words when I'm sort of talking to pupils and questioning pupils in the lesson. We would then intersperse bits of reading with comprehension questions. There are 5 comprehension questions at the end of each bit of reading, and we normally break those up into 2 chunks typically. So we do either 2 and 3 or 3 and 2, and we project them on the board. We, again, would often sort of do sentence starters. We'd write sentence starters up to get them going, and then pupils would do these in their books, in full sentences in their books. And these are really, as the sort of subtitle there implies, checking for understanding. We'd kind of circulate, we'd push pupils who finish them relatively quickly to include more detail or to expand their thinking. And then obviously we would provide support for those who were struggling to get going. In terms of how a unit would be devised then across or sort of designed across a half term, I mentioned earlier about sort of marrying up knowledge and skills, and you can see that I've just taken a screenshot there of the file in our shared resources for that Anglo-Saxons unit, the first unit of year 7. And you can see that the lessons by and large operate in pairs. So the first lesson of each pair would be the reading lesson, and that would be the lesson based around the textbook. So in the first Anglo-Saxons lesson 1 of year 7 would be the first double page spread, and we would aim to read at least all of that in the first lesson. Lesson 2 is then what we call the writing lesson off the back of that. And that would be where we'd be starting to introduce those skills that we want to teach alongside the knowledge. So in this first lesson, first unit of year 7, we're really focusing on selecting evidence. So we would be in that lesson, in the writing that pupils would be doing in that lesson, we'd be really focusing and explicitly teaching how to pick good bits of evidence from the reading that pupils have done to support the arguments they're making. You can see there in lesson 4, there's a writing workshop. And again, this is an innovation we've had over the last few years. We've built one of these writing workshops into each unit of work. And they are designed, there you can see it on the board there, they're designed again around that skill we want to develop in them. And that's kind of a sort of a lesson that is purely focused on developing that skill in the context of the knowledge that they have learned in the previous lesson. So this is a screenshot from one of those lessons. So picking knowledge, it's a kind of knowledge selection task. We would put these up one by one, get pupils to talk about them with the person next to them, and then we discuss them as a group, maybe get them to vote on their whiteboards again, which of those 3 they think is best and why, and then we talk about that. That would then lead into some sort of writing task. Again, we would do maybe a little 5 sort of 10-minute mind map with pupils on the board, get them to think about the knowledge that they have learned in the previous lesson. Again, they might do this individually to begin with, then in pairs, then as a whole class. And then with that knowledge that they gathered, they would do a piece of extended writing off the back of that. And you can see this is a kind of house style that we use across PowerPoints. That looks like a lot of information at once, but obviously we break this down and we put it up sort of bit by bit. And then the finished product emerges from that. And again, we would sometimes live model, so we'd sometimes live type into that, but often we would expect pupils to kind of get cracking with that once we'd sort of set them up. Key vocabulary down the side, and again, a really kind of clear structure too. And this sort of format, this house style, remains consistent from year 7 all the way through to year 9 as well. So that sort of element of familiarity is something that hopefully pupils become familiar with and benefits them as they go through. Just sort of drawing towards the close. Assessments, again, I talked about assessments a little bit earlier. That is something, again, that we sort of tailor to the specific skills and the knowledge we want to teach in each half term. It nearly always starts with a sort of timeline task. So you can see there it's matching the date to the event. We then follow that with normally 10 or 20 multiple choice questions based again on just precise bits of knowledge across the course. Those are normally bits of knowledge that are drawn from their knowledge organisers, which they have in their booklets that, as I mentioned earlier, we give out at the start of the year. And then we go into writing tasks. And the writing tasks, normally there is one based around the specifically based around the skill that we've been teaching. So you can see, again, this is the first assessment of year 7. For each of the following statements, provide 2 pieces of evidence that support the statement. And that is just, as I say, that's specifically focusing on that skill. And then also we have normally a longer writing task at the end as well. And at the start of year 7, that is just takes the form of a couple of paragraphs, but pretty quickly into year 7, as you saw earlier, sort of third half term, we would be getting them to write a whole essay as well. So sometimes an assessment might take a lesson and a half if we were to give them a whole lesson to do an essay, and then maybe half a lesson to do the more sort of knowledge part as well. Something as well that we are introducing into our assessments at the moment is tasks based around those substantive concepts. So tasks, for example, ask them to define what religion is or what an ideology is, and then to provide examples of the religion or ideology that they have been studying that half term, if that was what the substantive concept was. Just maybe finishing with a little bit of pupil voice. Obviously, always to be taken with a degree of pinch of salt, and it depends to the extent of the pupils you ask. But it is true to say that history is a really popular subject here, and the Key Stage 3 textbooks, the knowing history textbooks, have been really important in that. We always have a really good uptake at GCSE, and then at A level, we normally have about sort of 45, 50 pupils in a year studying history, which in a sixth form of 130 is pretty good. We tend to be the second biggest subject at A level, and as I say, really healthy uptake at GCSE as well. So pupils like it, and they sort of vote with their feet on that. As I say, high uptake GCSE and A level, and indeed at university. We normally have sort of 10, 20 pupils going to university to do history too. And as I say, they seem to really like that sense of moving through the textbook. There is almost that sense that they are kind of graduating onto the next textbook. They are moving on to something, and that's something we make a thing of as well. We say when we move on to the yellow textbook in year 9, we say this is now the hardest textbook there is. This is the most demanding textbook there is, but I think we're ready to deal with it. I think we're ready to tackle it, and that seems to land well generally in my experience with pupils. It's worth saying as well that they do really like the range of history that is taught. And they like the fact that I think there is kind of there's that clear chronological thread that draws them through the British history, but they also really do like the global history. And as I say, year 9, some of the units in year 9 in particular are really, really popular with pupils, and particularly as they get to that stage in year 9 where they're starting to be able to engage more with those big issues that some of the more global units give rise to. That lands well again in the classroom. And then pupils do like the enthusiasm that we teach with, and that kind of sounds like a given, but I think the textbooks do really lend themselves to that, because they do, as I was mentioning earlier, they do allow us, they kind of give us the framework, they give us the grounding from which we can then go and talk with the kind of the enthusiasm and the energy that we ultimately want to instill in our pupils too. So that's a kind of whistle-stop tour of how we organise the curriculum and then how we design a lesson as well. I think we've got a little bit of time now for some questions, and I think these are for both Rob and me. So if anyone has any question, I don't know, Harriet, if there's a way in particular you'd like to do this, but that's my piece.
Well, thank you so much, Harry, for that, and to Robert as well. It's been a really insightful webinar, and I hope everyone who's joined us today has learned a bit more about how these textbooks have been structured, a bit of the ideas behind how it was designed, and also, really importantly, the practicalities of using it in the classroom. We do have a few questions already, so I'll start off with those, but as we continue, people are still welcome to add any questions they have into the chat or into the Q&A function. We'll give it a bit of time, and then once we think we've exhausted all the questions everyone has for the day, we can close it at that point. And we will be sharing the recording afterwards. I've seen a note in the chat, someone saying that they missed the start. Don't worry, everyone who registered for today is going to receive a link to the recording afterwards, so you'll be able to catch up and then share with any colleagues who weren't able to attend live. Okay, so let's get started with the questions then. So the first one we have is, have you learned anything since first teaching this curriculum, and have you changed the way you deliver any of the units? I suppose this is a question really for you, Harry. I'd also add to that, I'd be interested to know, you said that you inherited a curriculum and you made changes. What were some of the changes that you made as well at that stage?
Okay, so if I take the first one first, so have I learned something? Yes, absolutely. One of the, was that about the challenges as well, that first question? What was the, it was about...
Yeah, so have you learned anything since you started teaching this curriculum, and have you changed anything that, the way that you teach it?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. Yes, absolutely. I mean, always learning. This is the sixth year that I'm using these textbooks, and still learning every year that I use them. I think one of the things that is always something that I'm kind of thinking about is the pace at which you move through a text. And that is definitely something that I think I've got better at the more I've used the textbooks, being able to judge better the sort of the ebb and the flow of the text, because inevitably there are parts of the text which are much kind of denser than others, and there are parts where there's more of a kind of a story that you want to move through at more of a pace. So that is definitely something I've thought about, and something I think really you just have to kind of use the textbooks to get experience of, knowing where the points are to slow down and where the points are to speed up. And that can mean at times actually that moving through the whole text is challenging, and at times I say to sort of, again, new colleagues who are joining the department, that it's fine sometimes to spill a lesson into the subsequent writing lesson. Actually, that's not the end of the world at all. So that's definitely something I sort of continue to play around with pace. Have we changed anything? Well, yeah, we have changed the curriculum, and again, we've kind of made a few tweaks here and there for what we teach and when we teach it. One of the things that, as I say, there are various iterations to this curriculum over the last few years, but one of the things we have changed is we've introduced more global history, actually, particularly in year 9. and we've broadened the range of and the parts of the world in which the parts of the world that we cover. Also, I'd say in at the end of year 9, you saw that British Empire unit as well. We've played around with that quite a bit, and the best way of teaching that, and the best way of drawing together those different sort of strands of different global history into that unit. So that's something we continue to play around with, and the interplay between that and the decolonization unit is something that we continue to play with. But yeah, it's a work in motion. It's something where we try something for a year and we think that wasn't quite that didn't quite land, or there were elements of that we'd like to draw out more, so maybe we can shuffle things around a bit. So it is something that's flexible and sort of a moving feast, really. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so our next question is, we know that disciplinary literacy is a big challenge across all subjects, and this person wants to know, how do you approach this in your classroom? Is this an idea that you've been engaging with as a history teacher? And Rob, you might also be able to add what you're hearing from other colleagues across different departments in the school too, briefly, if you'd like to.
Yeah, so I'm going to assume by disciplinary literacy we mean literacy within the context of that subject, so historical terms and historical, yes, we have a big focus on vocabulary. That slide that Harry showed of keywords is something that has been in there from the start, breaking down keywords, talking about their etymology, really focusing on those. When we do our quizzing, that will often be a big part of it, and it'll always be the case that it's half a mark for a misspelt word. We really make sure that that's something that pupils focus on and take seriously. And then in terms of writing skills, the paragraph structure that Harry showed as the house style for history writing was actually developed by our lead teacher of literacy, who's in the English department. And it's a paragraph structure that the English department use, the history department use, increasingly the divinity department will use. That's what we call religious education for some obscure reason. Geography, you get the idea. So that house style we've actually tried to make across the humanities and the English departments at Key Stage 3, so that pupils essentially feel comfortable with the regularity of it and the predictability. And when they see that paragraph structure, which is a lot of information, it actually isn't too much cognitive overload, because it's the same one that they saw the previous lesson in English. I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to add, Harry.
No, not really. I mean, perhaps the only thing is, that disciplinary literacy again is something we're conscious of, and it's something I suppose that we want them from a sort of pragmatic point of view. We want them to be familiar with for Key Stage 4 and 5 as well. So it is something that we try and talk about explicitly to pupils, trying to, as I say, model the sorts of terms that as historians we want to think about. So on a very basic level, it's thinking about the difference between interpretations and sources. That's something we talk heavily on in year 9, and we spend quite a lot of time thinking about what is the difference between an interpretation and what is the difference between a source, and the relationship between those two, and the sort of language you would use in evaluating both. So yeah, it's an integral part of what we do. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. I have one more question here. We'll see if there's time for any more afterwards, but this could well be the last one. So, do you have any advice about tackling resistance within school when wanting to integrate new units, particularly the global units? Now, I can imagine you've not had this issue at your school, but would you have any advice for someone who might have this problem?
If you don't mind me starting, Harry, I did some work with schools around the country introducing the Knowing History series, so got a bit of a sense of that. And I think the key thing to always emphasise is the integral interest in the subject content, and to really encourage your department to get excited about the content. And particularly if it's unfamiliar content, you always need to make sure that you give people enough lead in. It's very difficult if you decide that you're going to do a unit on modern China to tell them at a week's notice, because there's a lot of preparation you have to do, and it is challenging to teach something that you have no prior knowledge of. But to use that example, the modern China unit that we do at the end of year 9, that was written by a former colleague at the West London Free School, Harry's predecessor as head of history for the second editions of the books. I taught it for the first time last year. It was really challenging, but it was also incredibly rewarding. I had no idea who Sun Yat-sen or Chiang Kai-shek were before I was teaching it. And by the end of the time I was teaching it, I thought, this is wonderful. All of this stuff now makes so much more sense that I never knew about. So I think the key is to just really focus on kind of love of history, love of curriculum, and see those new units. As long as you don't completely overwhelm staff with an impossible amount of new units to master, sell it as a real opportunity to widen your own historical understanding.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, we have had experience of this to an extent in that we have changed exam boards at GCSE relatively recently. So we had to think about the how we would sell that to staff and how we would kind of go about rationalising that. And I think the important thing, as Rob said, is really explaining the rationale and saying this isn't just some arbitrary decision we've taken just kind of on a whim, but actually there are reasons why we think this will be beneficial ultimately to the pupils. But then also, yeah, as Rob says, trying to remember that this is amazing history that we want to teach, and allowing the history to sing for itself. And I think that is something that makes it so rewarding to teach history here and to teach it using the textbooks, because it is a curriculum and a way of teaching that allows the history to sing. It allows the past to speak for itself, and that, as a history teacher, is thrilling to teach, really.
That's wonderful. Thank you both. If I may, I'll just sneak in one last question sort of related to what you've just both been talking about. I'd be really curious to know what the student response has been to those global units in particular. I know you've said that, they can be challenging to introduce, particularly if you're not familiar with that history and you're having to do a lot of learning, even as the teacher and curriculum planner. But I'd be really interested to see, how has that payoff been in the classroom? Are students really resonating with those units? Are you seeing how having a kind of broader range of units and looking more globally has improved their experience at all?
Yes, in simple terms, they love it. And it's partly because year 7 and 8 are more British focused. So by the time they get to sort of the end of year 8 and then certainly year 9, a lot of them, I think, are ready actually for a bit of global history. So often we start with a lot of willing from pupils because they're really excited about it. And also, I think actually some of these units have a certain sort of mystique to them, like the Russian Revolution. Most of them don't know what it is before they study it, but it has this slight sort of aura. They've maybe vaguely heard of it. They've heard of the communists or the Bolsheviks, and it has a slight kind of edge to it. And again, communist China, most of them don't have a clue really what it is before we study it, but it has a kind of aura and it has a certain kind of mystery, which I think attracts them. And then, yeah, they really do enjoy it. And part of the reason I think they enjoy it is it does kind of resonate a lot with the modern world, and they are able to kind of pick up links between the history they're studying and some of the stuff that's going on in the news or kind of current affairs in a way that is obviously harder to do when you're studying earlier periods of history. So they like that, I think, generally as well.
Yeah, and we're a school bang in the middle of London. We've got, when we did a count of it, 84 different community languages spoken here. We are an incredibly diverse school, and the Year 9 curriculum is a really nice opportunity for pupils to see bits of their own community or their family history reflected in that 20th century curriculum. When we look at that unit that I was talking about modern China, but also the decolonization unit in particular, when we're looking at Kenyan or Ghanaian independence, or sort of independence movements in the Middle East after World War I, or Irish independence, pupils have an opportunity to see bits of their history in those lessons as well. And I think that builds a real enthusiasm behind the subjects as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's such a lovely note to end on, I think, as well. Yeah, creating curriculum that's really representative and helping those students to feel seen and valued through that. Thank you both so much for being our speakers today. Thank you everyone who's joined us online. We hope again that you've enjoyed today's session. We will be sharing that recording afterwards as soon as we've got it uploaded. So watch out for that in your inboxes. Please do watch it back, share with your colleagues. And you can also find out more information about this Knowing History series on our website at collins.co.uk/knowing history. So yeah, thank you again to our wonderful speakers for today, and I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. Bye.